The ATX form factor has been the predominant form factor in the computing world for getting close to 20 years. So if it's been around so long, well, what gives it such legs? Well, first of all, it was free. Intel pushed the standard, and as a result of that, everybody got into it, and the Taiwanese manufacturers and everybody started to back it. And once you get a standard that everybody likes in the computing world, it's hard to break away from. And we shouldn't. ATX works absolutely great. So in order to appreciate ATX, what I did is I've got a number of ATX systems in front of me, but here is a motherboard from the 1990s, and here is a brand new motherboard. So even though they're many, many years apart, they're both ATX. So let's start with this oldie goldie right here. This is a full-size ATX motherboard. It's 12 by 9.6 inches, and one of the things that ATX did that fixed a big problem with AT is that the AT form factor could only have little holes for individual items, and that didn't really work too well. So instead, ATX came up with the idea of an I/O area. Now, this is very fixed in size, but what you put in here is completely up to you. So you always get a faceplate like this that comes with every motherboard, because this has to fit to whatever it has in the back of the motherboard. So I can actually take this, and assuming I have an ATX case, which I do, I can stamp that in, and it always fits. Now, when you talk about ATX, ATX is not just one size. There are a lot of different sizes for ATX. For the A+ exams, there's only a few we need to cover, and I've got one here right in front of me. This is a micro ATX. Now what I'm going to do is I want to put it right over the full-size ATX, and you can see that it's in this dimension, it's pretty much the same size. It's a little bit shorter, which is fine, but most importantly, take a look at that I/O area. If you look at it really, really closely, you'll see that the I/O areas match up. In fact, the screw holes match up. So I could literally take this motherboard out of a system and put this one in as a replacement, and it would work absolutely perfectly. So when it comes to ATX, there are 4 different types of ATX form factor sizes I want you to be aware of. There's standard ATX, mini ATX, micro ATX, and the incredibly tiny Flex ATX. The Flex ATX is so small that it literally has nothing in the back but the I/O area itself. Now, when we talk about form factors, ATX defined the idea that it's not just the motherboard sizes. ATX also defined the power supply in terms of the types of connections that are used, as well as this front dimension. This is the part that actually screws into the back of the case, and this is very, very fixed in size. The length of the power supply, there's a lot of variance in there, and it has to do with wattage and how much money you want to spend, but this is very, very much fixed in size. So when we're talking about ATX, we're talking about a particular type of power supply that's literally called an ATX power supply with very fixed dimensions. Flex ATX was and is pretty cool. You can go out and buy a Flex ATX motherboard right now. Flex ATX was so small that it brought out a whole new genre of basically systems that were very low power and that were really, really quiet in general. And these were known as small form factors. Now, I'm not going to say Flex ATX was the first small form factor. There were some others out there, but they're really not on the A+, and they're not very popular today. However, it did bring out the idea of very small systems, really tiny, physically tiny systems that would do things like point of sale systems or home theater, things where you just needed kind of a single purpose client to handle one particular job. As a result of that, about around 2001, a company called VIA Technologies came out with a new form factor called ITX. Now, there is no standard ITX. In fact, what's actually kind of funny with ITX is that the 3 sizes that you need to know about are all subversions of the full-size ITX, which never even really came out. So I've got an ITX right here in front of me, and this is what we call a mini ITX system, 170 by 170 millimeters. It's very, very similar to ATX. For example, one of the things that it would do is that the I/O areas are relatively similar. It's pretty close, but it's not ATX, but it's close. ITX is designed for really, really low power. With ITX, you can use, depending on how the motherboard's set up, this particular one, I have to plug in an AC adapter, but you can also use them where they'll use a standard P1 connector as well. So this one is what we call a mini ITX. For the A+ exam, you're going to have 3 different ITX sizes you need to be aware of. There's mini ITX, nano ITX, and the incredibly small pico ITX. Now, if you're going to be talking about that kind of low power, keep in mind that there are standards in terms of low power power supplies. This is what we call, a lot of people call a flex ATX. Sometimes you even hear it called an ITX power supply. This is designed to fit into very, very small systems, and it provides power. The important thing to appreciate, it's still the same standard ATX connections, but it's just physically very, very small. The cool part about ATX and ITX is that between those 2 form factors alone, you can pretty much do anything from a big server system to a super tiny, tiny little thin client. These 2 form factors cover pretty much everything you need. I'm not saying there aren't other form factors. However, for the A+ exam, make sure you know your ATX and your ITX.